Imagine a tent, sliced open from the inside, abandoned in the snow, with boots, coats, and food still sitting untouched. 9 sets of footprints lead away from it, barefoot or in socks, walking directly into a sub-zero blizzard, away from safety, away from warmth, away from any rational chance of survival. Weeks later, searchers found the hikers scattered across the mountainside. Some without proper clothing, some with catastrophic injuries no fall could explain. One missing her tongue entirely. This isn't a horror film. This happened in the Ural Mountains in February 1959. And more than 6 decades later, nobody has ever fully explained what really happened that night.
The event became known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident, named after Igor Dyatlov, the 23-year-old engineering student who led the expedition. It remains one of the most thoroughly investigated, extensively documented, and stubbornly unsolved mysteries in modern history. Soviet investigators, Russian journalists, forensic scientists, and amateur researchers across the world have spent over 60 years combing through the same evidence, proposing theory after theory, and arriving at the same maddening conclusion. Something on that mountain caused 9 experienced, capable young people to abandon their shelter in terror and walk to their deaths in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. To understand how 9 skilled hikers ended up dead on a remote Russian mountainside, we need to understand who they actually were. This wasn't a group of careless amateurs. All 9 members belonged to the Ural Polytechnical Institute's sports club, experienced in cross-country skiing and wilderness survival, several holding advanced hiking certifications recognized across the Soviet Union. Their planned route would earn them Grade 3 hiker certification, the highest level available at the time, a serious technical achievement requiring genuine skill, careful preparation, and considerable physical endurance across some of the most unforgiving winter terrain the Ural Mountains had to offer. The group departed from the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, in late January 1959, ultimately intending to reach Otorten Mountain, a peak whose name, in the language of the region's indigenous Mansi people, reportedly translates to "don't go there." 10 hikers began the expedition, but one member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to worsening knee and joint pain, unknowingly saving his own life through nothing more than physical discomfort. The remaining 9 continued deeper into increasingly remote, mountainous wilderness, unaware that Yudin's departure would leave him as the expedition's sole survivor, forced to spend the rest of his life without answers. The 9 who continued were a close-knit group, several having hiked together for years, bonded by genuine friendship as much as shared athletic ambition. Igor Dyatlov, the expedition's leader, was known for his careful planning and technical expertise, having personally built specialized camping equipment for extreme cold weather conditions. Among the group was Lyudmila Dubinina, an experienced hiker who had already accumulated substantial wilderness certifications, and Semyon Zolotaryov, at 37, considerably older than his companions, a war veteran whose decision to join a student expedition later raised curious questions investigators would revisit repeatedly throughout their prolonged, ultimately inconclusive investigation of what happened. By January 31st, the group had reached the base of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, a name that translates ominously to Dead Mountain, referring to an old tragedy involving 9 Mansi hunters killed there generations earlier. A detail that seems almost too eerie to be coincidental, yet remains historically documented rather than embellished. The following day, February 1st, the hikers began ascending the slope, planning to cross over a pass and descend into a sheltered forest valley by nightfall. Deteriorating weather and disorientation, however, forced them to make a fateful decision that would ultimately place them directly in harm's way. Rather than descending fully into the tree line, where they could shelter among the forest, the group made camp directly on the open slope of Kholat Syakhl itself, exposed to the mountain's full, unforgiving fury. Later analysis of Dyatlov's own diary entries suggests this wasn't recklessness, but a practical decision. Descending and reascending the following morning would cost precious time and energy the group could not easily spare. It seemed, at the time, like a reasonable compromise. In hindsight, it placed all 9 hikers directly on an exposed mountainside, precisely when something, whatever it truly was, arrived in the darkness to shatter their expedition entirely. That night, the hikers pitched their tent, ate dinner, and by all accounts settled in for what should have been an unremarkable, if uncomfortable, night in freezing conditions. Diary entries and undeveloped camera film recovered later revealed a group in reasonably good spirits, despite the harsh weather, joking, planning the following day's route, entirely unaware of what awaited them. Then, sometime after nightfall, something happened that remains, even after 60 years of investigation, the absolute center of this entire mystery. Whatever it was, it caused 9 physically fit, mentally disciplined young adults to slice their own tent open from the inside and flee. When search teams eventually located the abandoned tent nearly 3 weeks later, what they found immediately signaled catastrophe. The tent had partially collapsed under snow, but more disturbingly, its canvas wall had been cut open from the inside, not through the entrance, but through the fabric itself, as though something had forced the occupants to escape immediately rather than take the additional seconds required to unzip and exit properly. Inside, investigators found boots, warm coats, food supplies, and personal belongings left completely undisturbed, exactly as though the hikers had been interrupted mid-evening and fled in overwhelming panic, without pausing even to grab basic protection against the brutal cold outside. This detail alone troubled investigators immediately. Experienced wilderness hikers, deeply trained in survival fundamentals, understood better than almost anyone the absolute necessity of proper footwear and clothing in sub-zero temperatures. Leaving a tent without boots in conditions this extreme wasn't simply risky. It was a decision virtually guaranteed to result in severe frostbite within minutes and death from hypothermia within hours. For 9 people to make that same catastrophic decision simultaneously suggested something far more urgent than mere carelessness. Whatever drove them from that tent had to have been perceived as an immediate, overwhelming threat, something terrifying enough to override every single instinct of trained wilderness survival. Following footprints preserved in the snow, search parties traced the hikers' path away from the tent, downhill toward a distant tree line roughly a mile away. The footprints revealed a chilling detail. They belonged to people wearing only socks, a single boot, or in several cases, bare feet, walking steadily rather than randomly scattering, suggesting a coordinated retreat rather than pure chaotic panic. This pattern raised an unsettling question that has never been satisfactorily answered. If the hikers were fleeing blind terror, why did their footprints show organized, deliberate movement toward a specific destination, rather than the disorganized scattering typically associated with sheer, uncontrolled panic under extreme threat? Near the tree line, searchers discovered the remains of a small fire beneath a large cedar tree, alongside the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both found wearing only their underwear, having apparently succumbed to hypothermia after attempting, unsuccessfully, to build a fire for warmth. Broken branches high on the cedar tree, up to 16 feet above the ground, suggested one of the men had climbed desperately, perhaps trying to spot the tent or watch for something approaching from a distance. His hands and forearms showed extensive cuts and abrasions from attempting to break branches for kindling using bare skin against wood in a temperature that would have caused excruciating pain within seconds. Searchers then discovered Dyatlov himself, along with fellow hikers Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustam Slobodin, scattered at varying distances between the cedar tree and the tent, apparently having died while attempting to return to the shelter, perhaps to retrieve warm clothing or supplies for the others. Their bodies showed positions suggesting they had collapsed from exhaustion and severe hypothermia during that desperate return journey, freezing to death alone in the darkness while struggling back toward a tent they never reached. Slobodin's autopsy later revealed a skull fracture, though investigators concluded it likely wasn't the cause of death, adding yet another disturbing, unexplained detail to an already deeply troubling scene. It took investigators over 2 additional months to locate the remaining 4 hikers, buried beneath heavy snow in a ravine roughly 75 meters further into the forest, discovered only after the spring thaw finally revealed what winter snowfall had concealed. When their bodies were finally recovered in early May, what investigators found transformed this case from a tragic wilderness accident into something far more disturbing and genuinely inexplicable. These 4 hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov, exhibited injuries so severe that Soviet forensic examiners initially struggled to explain how they could possibly have occurred without some form of extreme, catastrophic external force acting directly upon their bodies. Nikolai Thibault Brignoles had suffered a massive skull fracture, the kind of traumatic injury typically associated with a severe car accident or a direct, powerful blow, rather than any conceivable wilderness accident. Both Dubinina and Zolotaryov had sustained multiple broken ribs, injuries so severe that the examining pathologist compared the force required to that of a serious high-speed vehicle collision, an almost impossible comparison for injuries sustained on a remote, snow-covered mountainside with no vehicles, cliffs of significant height, or any obvious source of comparable blunt force trauma anywhere nearby. And then there was the detail that has haunted this case more than any other single piece of evidence. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, along with her eyes, part of her lips and facial tissue, while Zolotaryov was missing his eyes as well. Initial reports speculated this resulted from natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals during the weeks the bodies remained hidden beneath the snow, a biologically plausible, if deeply unsettling, explanation. Yet some researchers, examining photographs and forensic notes decades later, argued the tissue damage looked inconsistent with typical animal predation patterns, reigniting speculation about the case for an entirely new generation of investigators who found the original 1959 explanations frustratingly incomplete, insufficiently detailed, and unsatisfying given the genuine severity of what these young hikers had endured. Perhaps most disturbing of all were reports regarding radioactive contamination discovered on several of the hikers' clothing items during forensic testing conducted after the bodies were recovered. Certain garments, particularly a sweater belonging to Dubinina, tested positive for elevated radiation levels significantly above normal background readings. This detail, kept classified within Soviet archives for decades, only became publicly known years later, fueling intense speculation about secret weapons testing, military experiments, or some form of undisclosed nuclear incident occurring in the surrounding region during this exact period. Precisely the kind of information a secretive, security-obsessed Soviet government would have every conceivable motive to permanently, carefully conceal from public knowledge. The Soviet investigation, led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov, ultimately closed the case in May 1959, just months after the bodies were discovered, offering a strangely vague official conclusion. The hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force they were unable to overcome. This deliberately ambiguous phrasing satisfied almost nobody, explaining nothing about the tense mysterious slashing, the catastrophic internal injuries, the radioactive contamination, or the missing facial tissue. Soviet authorities immediately classified the case files, restricted public access to the investigation's full details, and quietly discouraged further inquiry, a response that, whether intentional or not, only deepened decades of suspicion and speculation surrounding what genuinely happened. This official secrecy proved particularly significant given the Cold War context surrounding the entire incident. The Ural Mountains region sat uncomfortably close to several highly sensitive Soviet military installations, including facilities associated with nuclear weapons research and testing. Rumors persisted for decades that the hikers had inadvertently stumbled into a restricted military testing zone, witnessing something the Soviet government considered far too sensitive to ever publicly acknowledge, prompting either direct military intervention or an accidental weapons test that resulted in their deaths. Soviet authorities, naturally, denied any such connection entirely, though their subsequent decades of official secrecy did remarkably little to actually dispel these persistent, deeply entrenched suspicions.
One particularly persistent theory centers on Soviet military testing of a specific parachute mine or experimental weapon in the immediate vicinity during the exact period of the hikers' expedition. Proponents point to reported sightings of strange, glowing orange orbs in the night sky by other unrelated hiking groups located in the same general region during that same February. Sightings independently documented in official meteorological records completely separate from the Dyatlov investigation itself. If the hikers witnessed something similar, a genuinely terrifying, inexplicable phenomenon lighting up the night sky above their tent, it could potentially explain the sheer overwhelming panic that apparently drove them to flee their shelter without any protective clothing whatsoever. Skeptics of the military testing theory point out a critical logical inconsistency. No genuine physical evidence of any weapons testing, spent ordnance, blast craters, or documented military activity has ever been definitively connected to the specific search area where the hikers died. Soviet archives, even those declassified following the collapse of the Soviet Union decades later, have never produced conclusive documentation confirming any military exercise occurred in that exact location on that exact night. Without direct physical evidence connecting a specific military test to this specific incident, the theory, however compelling and dramatically satisfying it might initially seem, remains firmly in the realm of informed, plausible speculation rather than proven, documented historical fact. A competing theory gained substantial renewed attention in 2019 when Russian authorities, facing continued public pressure and persistent international fascination, formally reopened the case for the first time in 60 years. Investigators ultimately concluded that a slab avalanche, a specific, relatively rare type of avalanche involving a compact, cohesive layer of snow suddenly detaching and sliding downhill, most likely struck the hikers' tent directly, forcing them to cut their way out and flee immediately into the darkness to avoid being buried alive beneath collapsing, potentially suffocating snow. This modern scientific explanation attempted to account for both the tent's sudden evacuation and several of the hikers' genuinely severe physical injuries. The slab avalanche theory received significant additional scientific credibility in 2021 when a team of Swiss researchers published detailed physics-based modeling in a respected scientific journal, using specialized avalanche simulation software combined with animation techniques originally developed for the film industry. Their research demonstrated that even a relatively small, localized slab avalanche, one too subtle to leave the obvious, dramatic visual evidence investigators originally expected to find at the actual scene, could theoretically generate forces sufficient to cause the severe rib fractures and skull injuries observed among several of the hikers, particularly given the tent's specific positioning directly against a rigid ski buried firmly beneath it in the snow. This scientific modeling offered a genuinely compelling partial explanation, but it still left several critical, nagging questions frustratingly unresolved. Why would experienced avalanche-aware hikers choose to camp directly on a slope steep enough to actually produce a slab avalanche in the first place? Slope angle measurements taken at the actual campsite location suggested conditions that, while not impossible for a slab avalanche, fell distinctly outside the range typically considered highest risk according to standard avalanche safety criteria. Critics of this otherwise scientifically rigorous theory argue that while it convincingly explains certain specific physical injuries, it still fails to adequately account for other deeply troubling details, including the missing tongue, eyes, and documented radioactive contamination. Other researchers have proposed a related, though distinctly different natural phenomenon: infrasound generated by powerful, specific wind patterns interacting with the unique, unusually rounded shape of nearby Holotsiakhl Mountain itself. Infrasound,
low-frequency sound waves existing below the normal threshold of human hearing, has been scientifically documented in certain specific conditions to induce genuine feelings of intense anxiety, unexplained panic, and even physical nausea in people exposed to it for extended periods. Under this particular theory, powerful winds moving across the mountain's distinctive shape could have generated exactly this kind of unsettling infrasound, triggering an overwhelming, genuinely irrational fight-or-flight panic response that drove the hikers to abandon their tent entirely without conscious, rational thought. This infrasound theory offers a genuinely elegant explanation for the group's apparently panicked, seemingly irrational tent evacuation, but critics note it still struggles considerably to explain the catastrophic, severe internal injuries sustained by several of the hikers. Injuries that infrasound exposure alone, however intense or prolonged, simply cannot plausibly produce through any known, scientifically documented physiological mechanism. Like nearly every other competing theory proposed across 6 full decades of dedicated investigation, this explanation successfully accounts for certain specific pieces of evidence, while conspicuously failing to satisfactorily address others, leaving researchers perpetually forced to combine multiple partial theories together in an attempt to construct anything resembling a genuinely complete, fully coherent overall picture. Some researchers have proposed a combined, multi-stage explanation for the tragedy. Perhaps a small avalanche or sudden sharp snowslide initially forced the hikers to flee their tent in genuine, immediate danger, after which the group, disoriented, freezing, and suffering the early stages of severe hypothermia, made a series of increasingly poor, impaired decisions in complete darkness that ultimately led several members toward that fatal ravine, where a subsequent secondary snow collapse then caused the catastrophic injuries discovered among the final 4 bodies. This layered, sequential theory attempts to weave together forensic evidence, environmental conditions, and known human physiological responses to extreme cold into one single, unified, internally consistent narrative. Hypothermia itself produces well-documented, scientifically established psychological effects that could genuinely help explain some of the case's stranger, more perplexing behavioral details. In its later, more severe stages, hypothermia frequently triggers a phenomenon researchers call paradoxical undressing, where profoundly, dangerously cold individuals begin removing rather than adding clothing, confused and disoriented by a physiological sensation that mistakenly feels distinctly like intense overheating rather than the actual life-threatening cold gripping their failing bodies. This well-documented medical phenomenon could genuinely help explain why some hikers were later found with partially removed clothing, though it still doesn't fully address why they initially fled the tent in the first place without any warm clothing whatsoever. The radioactive contamination discovered on the hikers' clothing has itself received considerably more scientific attention in recent years, with several researchers proposing decidedly mundane, non-conspiratorial explanations. Some of the group's clothing had reportedly been treated with thorium-containing camping lantern mantles, commonly used at the time specifically because thorium dramatically improved the brightness of portable gas lighting equipment. Other explanations point toward general background radiation naturally present near certain regional mineral deposits scattered throughout the surrounding Ural Mountains. While these more mundane explanations don't entirely eliminate every lingering question, they do meaningfully reduce the mysterious, sinister weight originally assigned to the radiation finding by generations of eager conspiracy theorists. Still, doubts about official Russian government explanations persist strongly among many independent researchers, journalists, and surviving family members alike, partly because of the Soviet government's initial decades of documented secrecy, and partly because certain physical details continue to resist truly complete, fully satisfying scientific explanation even today. The 2019 Russian government investigation, despite officially endorsing the avalanche theory as its primary, favored conclusion, still faced considerable public skepticism from experienced Russian journalists and researchers who had personally spent decades studying original case files, interviewing surviving family members, and painstakingly cataloging every documented inconsistency scattered throughout the original, deeply flawed 1959 Soviet investigation. Among the most persistent and enduring theories involves the Mansi people themselves, the indigenous inhabitants of this specific mountainous region, whose ancestors, according to genuine local oral tradition, had once suffered their own separate tragedy on this exact same mountain generations earlier. Early Soviet investigators seriously considered the possibility that local Mansi hunters, perhaps angered by the hikers unknowingly trespassing on land considered sacred, might have deliberately attacked the group. This theory was ultimately definitively ruled out after careful forensic and physical examination revealed injury patterns entirely inconsistent with any form of direct human physical assault, alongside a complete, total absence of any other human footprints found anywhere near the actual campsite. The mountain's original name itself, Kolatsiakl, meaning dead mountain in the Mansi language, long predates this specific 1959 tragedy by many generations, referring instead to an older, separate historical event involving the deaths of several Mansi hunters. Some researchers have speculated this older historical name might reflect genuine local traditional knowledge regarding some specific, recurring, naturally dangerous environmental phenomenon associated with this particular location, whether unusual, unpredictable wind patterns, distinctive terrain-based avalanche risk, or some other entirely natural hazard passed down carefully through generations of accumulated local oral tradition, long before any Soviet hiking expedition ever arrived to test the mountain's genuinely well-earned, historically documented, ominous reputation for itself. Paranormal and cryptid-focused theories have also flourished considerably around this case over the decades, ranging from encounters with the Russian folklore creature known as the Menk, an alleged Sasquatch-like being said to inhabit these exact remote mountains, to considerably more elaborate theories involving secret Soviet experiments, extraterrestrial contact, or genuinely paranormal supernatural phenomena. While these particular theories understandably attract considerable popular attention and dramatic online engagement, they remain entirely unsupported by any credible forensic evidence, and most serious, credentialed researchers dismiss them outright as sensationalized fabrications that, while genuinely entertaining as pure narrative, meaningfully distract from the more scientifically grounded, evidence-based theories that continue to deserve serious, focused academic and investigative attention within this particular ongoing case.
What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so uniquely compelling compared to countless other wilderness tragedies throughout history isn't merely the mystery surrounding exactly how these 9 people died, but rather the sheer, overwhelming volume of specific, carefully documented, genuinely strange details that resist any single, unified, fully coherent explanation. A slashed tent, barefoot footprints in sub-zero snow, catastrophic internal injuries without any obvious visible external wounds, missing eyes and tongue, documented radioactive contamination, reported sightings of strange lights in the night sky. Any single detail alone might carry a reasonably simple, straightforward explanation. Together, woven into one single tragic night, they form a genuinely disturbing puzzle that has resisted complete resolution for well over 6 decades.
Yuri Yudin, the 10th expedition member who turned back early due to persistent joint pain, lived for decades afterward, carrying the profound, complicated weight of having survived purely through sheer physical misfortune rather than any deliberate choice. He attended nearly every friend's funeral, personally helped identify their scattered, damaged belongings during the original investigation, and spent the remainder of his own long life fielding endless questions from journalists, researchers, and curious strangers about a tragedy he had personally, narrowly escaped by the thinnest of margins. Yudin passed away in 2013, having never received the complete, satisfying answers he had spent over 5 decades of his own life desperately searching for. The original case files, once entirely classified by Soviet authorities and considered permanently unavailable to any public or independent scrutiny, were gradually declassified following the collapse of the Soviet Union, allowing independent researchers direct access to original autopsy reports, investigator notes, and recovered photographs for the first time in decades. This newfound access fueled an entirely new generation of dedicated research, though it also, somewhat frustratingly, revealed troubling gaps and apparent inconsistencies within the original 1959 investigation itself, including missing pages, unexplained discrepancies between preserved photographs and official written reports, and several forensic conclusions that modern medical examiners now consider genuinely questionable, given today's considerably more advanced scientific understanding.
Modern forensic pathologists reviewing the original 1959 autopsy reports have noted several genuinely puzzling technical inconsistencies. The specific severity of the internal injury sustained by Dubinia and Zolotaryov, for example, seems difficult to reconcile with the complete absence of any corresponding external bruising or visible impact wounds on their bodies, a combination some experienced modern forensic experts consider genuinely unusual, even accounting for extended physical decomposition and the specific effects of prolonged, severe cold weather exposure. This particular detail continues to fuel speculation regarding alternative explanations even today, including highly specific pressure-based injuries theoretically consistent with certain forms of avalanche compression rather than any conventional, more straightforward blunt force trauma mechanism.
The recovered camera film, developed from cameras found among the hikers' abandoned belongings, provided investigators with a genuinely haunting final visual record of the group's actual last days, showing smiling faces, cheerful campfire scenes, and the surrounding, genuinely beautiful mountain landscape, entirely unaware of the impending tragedy about to unfold. One particularly blurry, out-of-focus photograph, taken from Krivonischenko's personal camera, appears to show a strange, indistinct light source in the surrounding darkness, though its actual, genuine significance remains hotly, endlessly debated. Some researchers argue it merely represents accidental light exposure or simple camera flash reflection, while others insist it potentially captures direct visual evidence of whatever genuinely mysterious phenomenon may have ultimately triggered the group's sudden, panicked flight. Diary entries recovered from several hikers reveal a group that, right up until their final, fateful night, remained in genuinely good spirits, actively discussing future expedition plans and thoroughly enjoying each other's close, established friendship, despite the genuinely harsh, demanding physical conditions surrounding their expedition. These deeply personal writings humanize a case that has, over decades, sometimes become reduced to little more than abstract forensic puzzle pieces and endless competing theories. These were real people, genuine friends, ambitious students with promising, hopeful futures ahead of them, whose final, tragic night together has since been endlessly, sometimes clinically, analyzed and dissected by generations of investigators and curious strangers who never once had the genuine privilege of actually knowing them personally.
The Dyatlov Pass incident gained substantially renewed international attention and popular interest following the 2013 release of a fictionalized horror film loosely inspired by the actual case, along with numerous subsequent television documentaries, dedicated podcasts, and popular online investigative video content. This surge in broader popular interest brought both welcome benefits and genuine drawbacks. Increased public and financial attention helped meaningfully fund additional serious forensic research and formal official reinvestigation efforts, while simultaneously spawning countless irresponsible, sensationalized conspiracy theories entirely disconnected from any credible, evidence-based historical fact. Separating serious, legitimate scientific inquiry from pure entertainment-driven speculation has become an ongoing, genuinely significant challenge for anyone attempting rigorous modern research into this particular, endlessly fascinating case. Despite the Russian government's official 2019 Avalanche conclusion, many dedicated, independent researchers remain genuinely unsatisfied, pointing toward what they consider significant remaining unexplained gaps within even this relatively sophisticated, scientifically grounded modern explanation. Why, these persistent skeptics reasonably ask, would the recovered avalanche debris show no obvious visual evidence at the actual campsite when investigators originally arrived, mere weeks after the incident itself occurred? Proponents of the official avalanche theory respond that the specific slab avalanche in question would have been genuinely small and localized enough that subsequent additional snowfall could have easily, naturally concealed any visible evidence well before search parties actually managed to reach the isolated, difficult-to-access location themselves.
This ongoing, still unresolved scientific debate reflects a broader, genuinely fundamental challenge inherent to this entire 60-year-old case. Evidence gathered in 1959, using considerably more limited forensic technology and investigative techniques, simply cannot be perfectly, completely re-examined using today's far more advanced scientific methods, because the original physical crime scene itself no longer exists in its original undisturbed state. Snow melts, terrain gradually shifts and changes, physical evidence naturally degrades over time. Modern researchers are permanently left working from photographs, incomplete written reports, and preserved physical objects, rather than direct, hands-on access to the original, complete, undisturbed scene. A significant, permanent limitation no amount of modern forensic technology can ever fully, completely overcome.
Family members of the deceased hikers have expressed genuinely mixed, complicated feelings regarding the case's continued, persistent fame and endless popular fascination. Some relatives have welcomed continued serious investigation, genuinely hoping renewed scientific attention might finally deliver long overdue definitive answers after so many decades of frustrating uncertainty. Others have expressed understandable frustration regarding sensationalized theories that they feel disrespect their deceased loved one's memory, reducing 9 genuinely real, complex young people with real families, real ambitions, and real personal histories to little more than abstract, endlessly debated puzzle pieces within an increasingly commercialized, entertainment-driven true crime and paranormal mystery industry that frequently prioritizes maximum dramatic effect over basic historical accuracy and simple human dignity.
A memorial now stands at the base of Kholat Syakhl, and the pass itself has been formally, officially renamed Dyatlov Pass in honor of the expedition's original young leader. Hikers occasionally visit the actual location, some drawn by genuine historical curiosity, others by the area's now considerable reputation for persistent, unresolved mystery. Local guides familiar with the specific region note that the mountain's weather patterns remain genuinely unpredictable and can shift dramatically within a matter of mere hours, a stark, humbling reminder that regardless of whatever specific combination of factors ultimately caused this particular 1959 tragedy, the fundamental, underlying danger of these remote, genuinely unforgiving mountains was, and unquestionably remains, entirely, permanently real.
Scientific consensus today leans cautiously, if not entirely unanimously, towards some combination of the slab avalanche theory and severe hypothermia-induced impaired decision-making as the most statistically probable, evidence-supported overall explanation. Yet even the most dedicated, rigorous proponents of this particular combined explanation readily acknowledge it doesn't fully, completely account for every single documented detail, particularly the specific, unusual pattern and severity of soft tissue damage observed on both Dubinina and Zolotaryov's bodies. Science, by its very nature, generally prefers the simplest explanation genuinely consistent with all available evidence. In this particular, unusually complex case, however, even the most scientifically rigorous explanation still leaves several persistent, nagging questions, frustratingly, genuinely unresolved.
Perhaps that persistent, lingering incompleteness is precisely why this specific case continues to captivate people so powerfully, even more than 6 full decades after it originally occurred. Unlike many other historical mysteries that eventually fade gradually from active public consciousness once an official, plausible explanation is finally reached, The Dyatlov Pass incident stubbornly resists that kind of comfortable, easy closure. Every proposed theory answers certain specific questions, while inevitably, frustratingly, raising several entirely new ones in its place. It exists in that same permanently unresolved space, occupied by history's other truly great unsolved mysteries. Close enough to genuine, documented scientific explanation to feel satisfying, yet never quite complete enough to fully, definitively close the case for good.
For the American audience encountering this genuinely chilling story for the very first time, the Dyatlov Pass incident offers something distinct from most familiar domestic true crime narratives. A mystery entirely free of any human villain, any criminal motive, or any deliberate, malicious act. Whatever specifically happened on that remote Soviet mountainside in February 1959, no one has ever seriously suggested another human being intentionally, deliberately caused these 9 tragic deaths. Instead, this case forces us to directly confront something considerably more unsettling: the genuine, humbling possibility that nature itself, combined with simple, extreme human panic under extraordinary, overwhelming conditions, can produce a scene disturbing enough that even experienced modern forensic scientists still struggle to fully, completely explain it today.
The mountain itself, of course, has never once offered any answers of its own, remaining exactly as ancient, remote, and genuinely indifferent as it stood centuries before 9 ambitious young hikers ever set foot upon its exposed, unforgiving slope. Wind still moves across Kholat-Syakhl's distinctive, rounded summit precisely as it always has. Snow still accumulates and eventually melts according to its own entirely natural, indifferent seasonal rhythm. Whatever specific combination of forces, whether avalanche, panic, infrasound, or some other factor investigators haven't yet even seriously considered, actually converged on that single, isolated February night in 1959, the mountain itself keeps that ultimate secret permanently, silently, exactly as it has for well over 60 full years now.
What remains undeniably, powerfully certain is the raw human tragedy at this story's genuine emotional core. 9 talented, ambitious young people, genuine friends bonded by shared adventure and mutual trust, entered these remote, beautiful mountains together with hopeful excitement, and none of them ever walked back out again alive. Their families spent the remainder of their own lives without complete, satisfying answers. Yuri Yudin spent over 5 additional decades carrying the complicated weight of his own accidental survival. And generations of dedicated researchers, forensic scientists, and genuinely curious readers worldwide have spent well over 60 years since collectively trying to understand precisely what happened during those final, terrifying hours on Dead Mountain.
Maybe the truest lesson buried within the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't found in any single specific theory, whether avalanche, infrasound, military testing, or otherwise, but rather in what this story reveals about the genuine limits of human certainty itself. We build sophisticated forensic science, deploy advanced technology, and dedicate entire careers specifically to explaining tragedy, desperately searching for order and complete rational meaning within genuine chaos and randomness. Yet sometimes, even with every single available tool at our collective disposal, certain events simply resist complete, final, satisfying explanation. 9 hikers walked into those remote, beautiful mountains in February 1959. What exactly happened to them that final, terrifying night remains, even now, the mountain's own silent, permanent, and genuinely unbroken secret.
If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think,
or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.